So Tom and I have tried to be retired for a while now. And we go around the world, and I give talks, and Tom takes pictures. And you're getting to see some of his cool pictures. Even that one, that's our daughter, but that was a very long time ago. Come on, let's go. So today, I would like to talk about friction. You know, in Lean, we used to talk about this idea of waste. And I've got a new term for it. And I think friction is a lot better idea. First of all, friction is analog. It's not on or off. And secondly, as you know, when you drive a car, you really don't want much friction, but if it's icy, you want a little bit. And so you don't want to totally eliminate friction. Can't completely do without it. But most of the time, things go a whole lot better with less friction. And so with that kind of introduction to the concept of friction, I want to talk about 3 kinds of friction. And the first kind of friction is friction in the customer journey. The customer who's the person who's using your software and their journey through your system to get some one of their purposes solved. And if there's friction there, that's probably the biggest problem with your system being successful. The second is friction in the process you use to develop software, which is, people have talked about that in the Agile world for, we're getting close to 20 years now. So something on that. And then friction in the code base, because anybody here who's ever developed software understands about friction in the code base. And I'll talk somewhat about that now, and there's a workshop at 10, and I'll sort of continue on and talk a little bit more about friction in the code base then, and then we'll do some breakout session. So let's start out with friction in the journey. So I was looking at a South by Southwest conference in Austin, Texas, and there was this really cool thing called Friction Lab. And so they had all the slides available. Sam Goodall put it on, and it was a really interesting concept that they introduced there, and that is people who are using, especially if they're using an app or a website or any type of tool like that, they have 3 friction budgets. And when their budget's used up, then you are in trouble or your system is in trouble. The first budget is time. They have only so much time they're willing to spend and willing to wait. The second budget is money. They have only so much money they're willing to spend. And the third budget is angst. Now, is that a good Polish word? Angst? What would be the right word for that in Polish? Angst. Okay, does that work? So, really, I am tense. I am concerned. I am nervous. And I don't know how well that translates into different languages, so I'm trying to learn. So angst, you know, like you see the storm coming and you see the clouds rising, and that's a problem. So let's talk about how to annoy customers by using up their friction budget, or their time budget. There's a really interesting study called Web Stress. It was done for the EU. And this is where you can find it. And I'm going to make these slides available because there's lots of footnotes and stuff with web references. So Paul will have to figure out how to make them available. I got them on a chip. And so what they did was they decided they would take the web speed that people were trying to use to do some job, shop, you know, put stuff in a cart or whatever, and they reduced it from 5 megabits per second, which is already not that fast, but kind of typical, down to 2 megabits per second. And then they put sensors on the people and they studied the impact of that kind of delay. And they found that their concentration went up by 50% because they had to spend a whole lot more time thinking. 77% of the people abandoned the site at the slower speed that would not have abandoned it at the faster speed. And the owner of the website was the bad guy. Okay, so if you happen to have a website and it is unacceptably slow, and unacceptable is not your call, it's in the eyes of the person who uses it, then it's your fault. You get blamed. So when you think about that, you really want to be sure that this kind of issue, slow response time, is something that is not going to be annoying customers in anything that you do. So that's one type of looking at their journey. There's another friction, and this friction is money. And you can annoy customers really, really, really easily by, generally speaking, what we say in English is nickel and diming them to death. That's adding all kinds of extra little fees on at the end. So if you go to the airport, especially if you happen to be in the US, you pay for every piece of luggage you bring. Usually not here at the Alliance Airlines in Europe, but for sure in the US. And you pay for, I don't know, everything. And it's annoying. It's not that it's expensive. It's not even that you don't know it's there. It's that it's tacked on at the end and it's annoying. Along those lines, 44% of shoppers tend to abandon the cart at the end when they see the shipping fees. Shipping, you'd think, would be a reasonable fee, an expected fee, but you can lose almost half of your shoppers for that little bit of extra money that you're trying to get at the end. So you have to think about the journey of the customers, and you think, I've got what I want, I'm ready to buy it, I'm ready to do whatever it is that I want, and you add that extra little cost, and I say, forget it, I am not interested. You've just used up my money budget. And then there's the angst budget. This is actually a very interesting story about how to reduce angst. This is Kenya. And M-Pesa is not a new system. It's been in Kenya now for almost a decade. And it is a way to transfer money amongst people by mobile phone. And M-Pesa is sponsored by the mobile phone operator that is, what's the name of it? Anyway, the mobile phone operator in Kenya said, you know, banks here are few and far between considering where the people are. Hard to get to. It's hard for people to put money there. It's very, very hard to move money between one organization and another, or to send money to your family or anything like that. What if, you know, we have little mobile operators, people who sell mobile phones all over the country. What if every one of those mobile operators was also a mini bank? And so they set it up so that if you wanted to pay a little bit of money to send it home to mom or whatever it is you want to do, you go into your local, you know, phone operator who's right on the same bank of things as the market. So it's Sunday market, and you go in, and right there's a little cell phone operator, and you give them the latest wages that you made from whatever vegetables you brought in, and then you email to your mom authorization to take $2 or whatever it is out, and then halfway across Kenya, she can get some money that afternoon. Compared to what it was like to do things in the bank, it was way easier, way less time, way cheaper actually, even though there was an add-on fee, not that much, because those mobile operators had to make a little money from this. But the big problem was that people didn't trust banks. Money tended to disappear. They tended to have really strange, enormous fees that took all your banking away. And so it removed the angst of getting that money from here to there safely. And it's amazingly successful. 68% of Kenya adults use mobile money with M-Pesa. And that's all through the country, from the smallest farmers to the 68% of all adults, not families, but adults. 21% have bank accounts. So it's really completely replaced the banking system in that country because it dealt with the fact that the banking system wasn't dealing with angst. Now, if you're in any kind of environment where you are creating angst, or you are creating frustration because of fees, or you are creating fees that don't seem justified, or if you are taking people's time when they don't want to spend it, then you are creating a wide open opportunity for somebody else to come in and create a better journey for your customers, and that journey will attract them every time. So it's something to watch out for and something to pay a lot of attention to no matter what kind of software you're developing. Now I'm going to go to a little theory behind that. Some of you may have heard of Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman. Okay, so he's not a surprise to everybody, but he basically wrote the book on cognitive biases. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But before that, going with that, he starts out in his book by talking about we have two ways of being. Sort of we can be in one system or another. And sometimes people call it our rational system and our emotional system or something like that. So over here on what you might call the emotional system is system 1. He says there's so many names, I'm just going to call them system 1 and system 2. Okay, so here's system 1. System 1, we do stuff fast. And system 2 is slow. System 1 is reflexive, okay? If a child the second time touches a hot burner, they know to pull their hand back really fast. They don't think, they just pull. First time, they have to think. After that, it's just reflexive. But with system 2, you do things deliberately. You think first. System 1 is very responsive to whatever the situation is. System 2 is very rational. Weigh all the odds. System 1 is about, interestingly enough, expertise. Because experts know instinctively what the right thing in their field is to do. System 2 is about analysis, looking at the numbers and checking everything out. System 1 is about intuition, of which there's something to be said for intuition. And system 2 is about having evidence, and there's something to be said for having evidence too. System 1 is about habit. In fact, habit is really hard to overcome. System 2 is about making plans. System 1 is tacit knowledge. I know it because I know how to ride a bike because I've been doing it since I'm a kid. But I can't give my granddaughter a book about how to ride a bike. That's explicit knowledge. It's written and doesn't do her any good. I have to transmit tacit knowledge. So explicit knowledge is stuff you can write down on paper and hand it over, and tacit knowledge is stuff that's sort of in your head. So when you're in system 1, you're on autopilot. And you know what? If you weren't on autopilot when you breathe and when you eat, you would have an awful tough day. So autopilot is good to handle a whole lot of stuff. And system 2 is manual mode. Now, Kahneman says that an interesting thing is that system 1 makes most of our decisions. Okay? And system 2 checks up on system 1 to see that system 1's behaving. And system 1, however, will override system 2 every time. So if you have a rational excuse and an emotional impulse, which one wins? Pretty much system 1 every time. And interestingly enough, system 2 is basically lazy. So system 2 would rather not do the work and is very happy to let system 1 make most of the decisions. So if you think about that, when you think about designing systems, you and your customers both have those systems. And I want to propose that there's times to be in system 1 and times to be in system 2. So the thing about being lazy is I don't want to have to think. The cognitive overhead the system places on the people who use it is friction. So if people are using your system in any way through any journey that they're taking, and you place cognitive overhead on them, you make them think, then that's friction. You want people to breeze through your system without having to think. You'll be better off. Let me give you an example. Here is a website. And here is you going to put in your email address and password and log in or register. Okay? Does it look reasonable, rational? Right? Okay, fine. But what you're doing is saying, register. Wake up, system 2, it's time to register. And system 2, register? Huh? You kidding, what's that? I don't want to register. Now, the people who designed this saw no problem with it, but they were losing an awful lot of conversions, huge amounts. So they had a group come in and check out all of the different where people were banning it, and they were banning it on this page, and they finally managed to put the instrumentation in to say, you know, that register button, it's like turning people off. So They made very simple proposal and a very simple change. Log in or continue with a little note. You don't have to create an account to purchase a product. And immediately, the number of purchases went up 45%. The first month revenue went up $15 million, and the annual revenue $300 million. So this is a $300 million mistake. Okay? And it's because people were trying to wake up System 2 because they needed that information anyway, but they made their customers think on their journey, and rather than think, they just abandoned it. So when you're designing a system, you have to assume that the people you're designing for don't want to think. They're in System 1, okay? They're cognitively lazy. They want to be on autopilot. You also have to understand that they're cognitively biased. Everybody is, and including the people that you're trying to attract, like, of course I'm right, and hands off my stuff. I'll tell you a little bit about those two. So hands off my stuff. One of the big cognitive biases is loss aversion. So the studies show that we feel the pain of a loss 2 times more than the gain of a corresponding win. So what does that mean? So here's some reusable shopping bags. And in Minnesota and in Maryland, where my son lives, everybody's encouraged to reuse reusable bags, but you know, there's some overhead there and people don't always think about it. So in Montgomery County, Maryland, where my son lives, they instituted a 5-cent charge in every single store for every single disposable bag that they give to a customer. It's required that the customer has, not the store, but the customer has to pay 5 cents for every little plastic bag. Okay? Now in Minnesota, they have a policy, which is very, very common, that any store, every time you give them a reusable bag, they will give you 5 cents credit on your charge. Maybe they'll give it to a charity, but say they put it on your charge. Now, which one of those schemes do you suppose is more successful in getting people to use reusable bags? Which one? First one? Second one? Why the first one? You don't want to pay 5 cents. You think about that as you leave your house. If I don't bring some bags, I'm going to have to pay 5 cents. The fact of getting 5 cents back is so much less important than paying 5 cents, because that's loss aversion. It's my money, don't touch my money, rather than I have get some back that I already thought that I lost. Loss aversion is real, and the compliance rate for reusable bags in Montgomery County is massively higher than in Minnesota because of the loss aversion, because people don't want to pay that extra 5 cents. So your customers are like that too. If you take money away from them at the end, rather than include it in the price, they're much more likely to abandon their whatever they're doing. And then confirmation bias, one of my favorites. So we seek out, you seek out, I seek out, we all seek out, honest, every one of us, information, and we interpret information in a way that is going to confirm our pre-existing points of view. We do that. It's almost no way around it, and I'm freely willing to admit that, you know, I'm very biased. And I love this cartoon because it's a teenager saying, "Hey, Mom, who's more open-minded, liberals or conservatives?" And Mom says, "Well, most people are open-minded about ideas they already agree with." So what good is that? That's what she wants to know. What good is it if you're open-minded about ideas you already agree with? That's basically the definition of confirmation bias. People are open-minded about ideas that they already agree with. So you have to think about those biases as you design systems. And then there's another interesting thing that I'm just going to throw in for fun, along with one of Tom's better pictures. Half the time, and I'm not just making this up, I'm getting it from a couple of sources, the product manager's ideas on what's going to be good for the product are wrong, or more. And product managers, who are a few of you here, I'm right, aren't I? They actually don't often get to admit this if they have no way to prove that their ideas are right or wrong. But most product managers I know would be very, very pleased to have ways to find out whether or not their ideas are right or wrong. If they're supposed to be God, well, they'll try to be. But fact is, if you look at the research, down here some online experimentation done at Microsoft on this. And also if you look at most of the stuff that Marty Kagan, who's a big product management guy, talks about, it's product managers are guessing just as much as anybody else. So we have a process, it's called, well, we have various processes that have this person called product somebody, product owner, product manager, product somebody, who's supposed to know all the answers. We have to abandon that idea because there is no way that the product person is going to know all the answers. We need a process that includes a product person in figuring out what are the right answers. And one last one I want to talk about, this is kind of maybe a little pickup on what we were talking about yesterday morning, and this is conformity bias. So this is an extremely interesting book. It opened my eyes. It's called Wiser, and it's by, Smart. Okay, anyway, it's how does confirmation of bias apply to groups, teams? We're really big on putting teams together and letting them decide, right? The main conclusion of this book is that deliberating groups are oftentimes, usually, dumber than groups that don't deliberate. Wow, how can that be? The reason is because of conformity bias. Deliberation tends to make group dumber because there's this concept from Elizabeth Noel Neumann from the 50s about the spiral of silence. And it basically says people like to be in the majority. They like to conform to the group majority. And so they basically take a look around and see whether or not their opinion is the opinion held by either the senior people or the majority in the group. And if they perceive that they're in the minority, there is a very strong tendency to self-silence or to change your opinion, which of course makes it harder for other minority opinions to emerge. Now, why do you want diversity? Because you want a variety of opinions. But if you set up a group that behave in a pretty natural way, you're actually going to get conformity bias, causing the people who are not in the majority to be quiet, to conform to what the group thinks. And if you don't create an environment where, for instance, for example, in the Marines, when the very rapid U.S. Marines, their very rapid deploy force, and they get their mission, the night before they head off, and they all go to a briefing. And then they have a rule, a process. And the rule is that after the briefing, they get together and talk about the mission, and the most junior people must speak first. And they speak in order of reverse seniority, so that no senior person is biasing the opinions of the most junior people. Another thing that we tend to do, we tend to have stickers and vote on priorities. What's happening when you set priorities is that the minority opinion will automatically be ignored. You're setting up a process which says if you are in the minority, don't even bother to contribute because your opinion is not going to get paid attention to. We're going to vote and you have to be in the majority in order for it to work. I'm not sure that's such a good process. So think really hard about how ways that your groups work might in fact create conformity bias. Because there's experiments that show if you take, so come to the US and we've got Democrats and Republicans. So they'll take two groups, majority Democrat and majority Republican, then they'll both be sort of middle of the road. Then they'll send them off and not even tell the people who's in the groups. And the one that's majority Democrat will become extreme. And the one that's majority Republican will become more extreme every time. So if you take people with a bias and put them in groups, whatever the majority bias is tends to become more extreme. So you have to think really hard about how you encourage people's contribution. I went to a manufacturing plant as an IT manager years ago, and my boss, Dave Dolger, really cool guy, told me maybe one of the first days, he said, we really like to have a woman here because 80% of our employees here are women, and we got to have a woman on the management team. And my first job was to go to the women's bathroom because they had a request to put a shelf in for purses, and the guys didn't want to deal with it. I thought, oh, I can handle that one. And he said to me, very early from after I got there, he said, so Mary, if you and I have the same opinion about everything, one of us is superfluous, and it's not me. So think about that. If you tell people who are in a minority group in your groups, if they agree with the majority all the time, they don't even need to be there. They're superfluous. You need to encourage people with outlying opinions to feel very comfortable putting their opinions into the pot. And it's not natural and not normal. So you need mechanisms and thought processes which allow the whole group to comfortably contribute their opinions, even if they don't conform to what everybody else is. And in no environment anywhere is that a natural thing to do. So only some groups get to that point. So the second thing I want to do then is move on to system 2. We need to design for system 1, but we need to design with system 2, because our groups that are designing these things, our development groups, have biases. And they can have lots of biases. That's when you want to flip into system 2 and start using analysis and data and analytics and ethnography, going out and seeing what things are really like, learning. So you want to, as you design, you want to be in system 2. I want to show you one really interesting example of ethnography that I just love. And this is about a principal designer, Doug Dietz, who worked at GE Medical and GE Healthcare. And in Milwaukee, which is, by the way, where Tom and I both grew up, and GE has a big healthcare development area there. And one of the things they do is these things. Doug's baby was an MRI machine. He was the engineer, chief engineer, the chief designer that designed this machine. And when it first came out, some, 5-7 years ago, he went to the Children's Hospital in Milwaukee because they bought one of the first versions. So he wanted to see it actually being used, which, good chief designer, good idea. So he went to Children's Hospital, which I know very well, and he walked in and they showed him it, and then he was so proud of it, and the nurses liked it, and he asked them all questions. And then they said, say, Doug, you're gonna have to step out in the hall because an actual customer is coming. And so he did, he stepped out in the hall, and he looked down the hall, and this is what he saw. He saw a screaming child. And just as soon as the child actually looked in the room and saw his baby, absolute shriek, totally terrified. What does that look like to a kid? He found out from talking to the nurses that 80% of children ages 3 to 7 have to be sedated to have a CAT scan. This is CAT scan, right, or MRI? This is MRI. They have to be sedated in order to do it because you have to lay really still for a long period of time. And he decided that they were his customers and that this was unacceptable. So he, by himself, because he could, because it was his job, went back to his team and said, we're not done. We need to create a machine that is not going to require children to be sedated. So they started studying children. And they found out that children think differently, and that kind of age range, they use their imagination for all sorts of stuff. And they finally came to a conclusion. I might talk about this in the workshop a little more, but they went through the journey of the child, and they decided to create a new journey in which the child was coming in to, say, go camping, or go into a submarine, or go into, swim in the sea, or something like that. So here is their camping MRI. And here's the book that the child's parents get to take home and go over the day with the child, how they're going to get a seatbelt and how they're going to have to lay really still and that sort of thing. This has been copied by almost every medical manufacturer around anymore, some way or other, but it was extraordinarily successful. They stopped having to have sedated children. Now, what happens when you don't have to sedate children? First of all, it's a whole lot safer. Secondly, it's a whole lot less expensive. Thirdly, it takes a lot less time. And fourth, the parents are delighted. All of this means that Children's Hospital, where they did their first one, got a whole lot more word of mouth. And all of the people who had kids that needed MRI started coming there. They had more time slots because they didn't have to sedate the children. And it was a massively successful business decision. But he didn't make a business decision. He made a decision that said, if children have to be sedated because of my MRI machine, I'm not done. That customer journey is unacceptable to me. We're going to fix it. Not saying, oh, and then we're going to get more money. It had nothing to do with it. It had to do with my customers have to like my product or I am embarrassed. And that's what we have to think about when we look at the customer journey. So let's talk about friction in the process. And here I want to show you a video. Let's hope that the sound works. That's the theory anyway.
I've spent a lot of time over the years making creative tools.
Can you hear?
Using creative tools, thinking about this a lot. And here's something I've come to believe. Creators need an immediate...
I'm going to stop this for a second while it was loud, but let me see if changing my volume helps, but I'm pretty sure it's at the top already. Yeah. Otherwise, I'm going to use, where's your mic? Oh, you did? Okay. I think I'm going to go back to, yeah, you did. Hang on. Okay, let us see if I
to
start.
what they're creating. So that's my principle. Creators need an immediate connection to what they create. And what I mean by that is, when you're making something, if you make a change or you make a decision, you need to see the effect of that immediately. There can't be a delay, and there can't be anything hidden. Creators have to be able to see what they're doing. So what I have here is I've got this picture on this side, and the code on this side, and this part draws the sky, and this draws the mountains, and this draws the tree. And when I make any change to the code, the picture changes immediately. So the code and the picture are always in sync. There's no compile and run. I just change things in the code, and I see things change in the picture. And now that we have this immediate connection between the code and the picture, we can start thinking about ways of changing the code other than typing. So for example, this number here is the length of the branches. If I want to control that number, I just point my mouse to it, hold down the control key, and I can dial it up and down. So I can see what it looks like for big branches or small branches, and I can kind of converge on what feels right to me artistically. And this works for any number of the code. I just point to it, dial it up and down. And some of these numbers here, I know what they do, but it's still kind of surprising to see them do it. And other ones are just completely surprising. So down here, I've got this for loop where I'm counting to 16. I'm putting 16 little pink blossoms on every branch. And I can turn that down for less blossom or turn it up for more. But look at what I'm doing here. I'm just kind of moving that number up and down around 20 or so. And it has this really interesting shimmering effect. It kind of looks like the wind is blowing through the tree. And the first time I saw this, I immediately started thinking about how I could use this effect for an animation. How would I ever have discovered that if I had to compile and run between every change? So much of art, so much of creation is discovery, and you can't discover anything if you can't see what you're doing. So having this immediate connection allows ideas to surface and develop in ways that would be impossible before. And that is so important to the creative process, to be able to try ideas as you think of them. If there's any delay in that feedback loop between thinking of something and seeing it and building on it, then there's this whole world of ideas which will just never be. These are thoughts that we can't think. And the thing about ideas is that ideas start small. Ideas start out tiny and weak and fragile. In order to develop and mature, ideas need an environment where the creator can nurture them, and kind of take care of them, feed them and shape their growth. And to me, that's what this principle of immediate connection is all about.
So that's Brett Victor, amazing designer. You may have heard of him. And his basic principle that runs his life is the creators need an immediate connection with what they create. And a wonderful discussion of that. I think we need to have the same thing in our process. Product teams need an immediate connection with the product they create. If you have a delay, then your fragile ideas don't get developed. And we need a process that supports that. I show you something else. This time, you have the volume still up, yes? Because I'm going to do another one. But I'll tell you first who these are. This is David Nieberg, and this is Jenny Nieberg, and that's Henrik Nieberg. You may have heard of Henrik. Henrik was giving a talk at Go to Copenhagen last year. And he likes to take his children, he has 4 of them, along on trips, just because he likes to have them there. And also, he finds they learn English better when they're in any country. Because, as Emma, his third one, said when we were in Hamburg together, so people here speak German, huh? Yes. You get a choice. You can speak German or you can speak English, but you can't speak Swedish because only people in Sweden speak Swedish. Oh, okay. I'll take English, she said. And so anyway, these 2 were coming to the conference with him, and they were going to have a sumo robot, Lego sumo robot contest. If you don't know about it, you get to see around, so you'll see how it works. And so all of the developers coming were encouraged to bring a robot program to wrestle, okay? And so when his kids heard this, David's 12 and Jenny's 11, they said, we're going to compete, and we're going to win. Henrik, maybe. If you want to get the whole story, here's the blog that you should go take a look at. So anyway, they spent time. They put together a robot. They were sure they were going to win. Of course, Henrik was wise enough as a father to keep his mouth shut. He was their coach, but pretty much they decided everything. A little bit more about that. And as the contest went on, they kept winning every single one. And this is the championship match. Come on, championship match. Let's go.
Might actually be the last game of the tournament, but developer experience is all enough. But it's still something.
See Jenny videoing?
Developer experience is fighting along.
We're still learning.
But it's not over yet. Let's get it!
And that's pretty much handily how they won every single match. Now, the question is, how did 2 kids out-engineer a collection of the top software engineers in Europe? And that's what they did. This was their process. First of all, Henrik wasn't going to do it for them. This was their project. He was there to give them some ideas. So David built a robot, and he programmed it. And Henrik said, maybe let's just make a minimum viable robot to begin with. Okay, so that was the idea. So there's their minimum viable robot. Keep it simple. And then Henrik said, maybe we need a sparring partner. So a sparring partner, Jenny says, I'll do that. And she got out the Lego instructions and built a standard Lego robot because that was easier for her. And it turned out that it was heftier than this one and actually was able pretty much when they sparred to beat this one. So minimum fighting robot was their next thing. Okay, so now they had 2 robots. This one was smart and this one was strong. And they eventually moved all the smarts over to the strong one. They had a small, strong, smart robot. And their goal before they went to the conference was to be able to take and every single time they put the 2 robots together, one really dumb and not very strong, and one smart, and every single time the smart one had to win. That was their goal. And they did a lot of stupid things. He even has a video of one of them. And they made lots of mistakes, but they kept getting better and better, and eventually before they left. And they tried things like a big pushover that would pick things up, but it was too complicated. And so after a long time of doing this, they went to the conference, and Henrik didn't have a lot of hope, but they won every single match. Because they had tested their robot a lot, and they had figured out all kinds of the failure modes, and they had this immediate feedback, immediate connection, and they had on their floor, they taped out a circle, and they had the robots doing it. Jenny was always doing video so that they could analyze them. They went on the web and looked at ones online, figured out best techniques, tried them, and so on. So Henrik said that when they went home, they were kind of spoiled for life. They were never going to want a job in which they couldn't become immediately involved in solving the problem at hand, because they got a taste of what it was like to solve problems that was really fun. And this immediate connection is something we must have in our processes. And we don't have this anywhere near often enough. Your standard classic agile process doesn't. A 2-week iteration is too slow. A product owner telling a team what to do is not an immediate connection. Okay? So let's take a look at what we really need to think about. We have to stop having delivery teams. We need to start having problem-solving teams. Okay, here's a delivery team. You get instructions, and they are carried out, and you're measured against whether or not you did it, versus what we really need to have today. You have a problem, and you figure out how to solve it. This is so much more fun, and it taps the creativity of everybody involved, not just one person giving out instructions. So here is the process that I think would take a lot of friction out of our current processes. First of all, you start with signals, not requirements, but signals. Something needs to be done differently. The robot got pushed out. The customers are abandoning the site, whatever. And then you focus on problems, not features. What customer problem am I trying to solve? Okay, why are they abandoning the site? Why is my robot getting shoved out of the room every time that I get in this kind of a situation? And then you plan with hypotheses, not estimates. The idea of estimates is kind of interesting. I've always thought it to be silly, and it gets even sillier when you look at this process. It's hypotheses. What do I think? If I do this, what do I think the answer will be? Okay? There's a really important role for product manager or product owner, whoever, in this spot. Come up with hypotheses. I believe that if we do this, we will get this result. Let's see. And then you run experiments, lots of them, as fast as you can. You heard this yesterday if you went to, and you'll hear it again at the next keynote. And you analyze, you make conclusions, and you do it again. This is the process. This is a pretty classic engineering process. And we are basically doing tough engineering problems anymore these days in software development. This is the process that we should be using. Much less friction than some of the processes you might be using now. I'm just going to tool on to friction in the code. I don't have nearly enough time, as I said, to do all of this, so probably at 10 o'clock, for those who are in the workshop, I'll continue on a little bit more with this. But let's think about friction in the code. This is a book on war. It's a classic. It's not very new. Von Clausewitz's classic on how you look at war back when there were horses and cannons. And he talks about the biggest problem in war is friction. I call friction large system disease. Okay, when you have thousands of people in the army and horses and stuff like that, stuff just doesn't go the way you plan it. Because you can think to get this army from here to here is going to be this much days, this much march, this much time, but you forget that there's bogs and that soldiers get sick and horses get tired and all that sort of stuff. So he says friction is the concept which distinguishes real war from war on paper. The military machine is composed entirely of individuals, each of which keeps up their own friction in all directions. You can think of this as the code base, is composed of lots of little things, each of which has its own friction in all directions. And their enormous friction is everywhere. And it's brought together by chance. This is our unexpected consequences coming from, whoops, I didn't know those two things would happen together. And this friction is the thing that makes what appears really easy really difficult. Okay, so people have been explaining this in war for a long time. You have to spend it in your code base. It's pretty much the same explanation. There's just a huge amount of friction when you have a lot of moving parts. And it's the friction in the code that we need to figure out how to attack. This is one of my favorite pictures of shipping right up through the 1950s and 60s. This is how goods moved around the world. The reason why we have so much inexpensive international commerce today is because of this, the container. Now, this is a really fun book because it tells the history of the container. It has nothing to do with software and has everything to do with software. But it doesn't say software anywhere in the book. It talks about how we went from this kind of shipping to that kind of shipping, and the massive economic benefit that came from it. It basically changed commerce. It changed the economy of the world as we know it. And in fact, as far as the author is concerned, it's probably the biggest change in the world economy that's happened in the last 50 years. So it's taking the friction out of, you break a thing of flour, it gets wet, lots of things happen. But really one of the big impetus for containers was the Scottish whiskey industry. Because somehow or other, those kegs of whiskey would never, all of them, get to the port. They would kind of get like 30% loss every time. Then they put them in containers and they actually made it. So that was really a big economic benefit. So containers, good stuff. The idea that you think how to remove the friction and automate the process. And that's what we're trying to do too. We need to take the friction out of our code base. Now here is an enterprise architecture. Does this look familiar to anybody with enterprise architecture? I warned you. This is enterprise architecture. And it's interesting because here's this data here. The system of record. All right? The important thing to understand about that database is it is the massive coupler that couples everything in the system together. Everything has to work through the database, which means I can't make a change here unless somebody makes a change there. It means that I have to change everything all at the same time. It means all of our releases have to be coordinated and built because of the database. Pretty much the fact that we have decided that this is the proper enterprise architecture is what has caused our massive, massive big release systems. It doesn't have to be that way. Monolithic central database creates deep dependencies and high friction. One of the big things that's happened in the cloud is not exactly the cloud, it's the cloud architecture. So when you think about a federated architecture, where every little federation has its own data structure and its own data stores, and they're distributed. And these guys can be put in and out independently of each other and coordinate in a totally different way than through the database. Then you have a microstructured architecture and distributed data. This kind of federation is where we get low friction. And if you look at any kind of architecture, just take the internet, for example. The internet is a fundamentally federated architecture. That's why it works. And as you take a look at any architecture around that really scales, it will be scaled because it's federated. If you can't federate, you can't actually scale very far. You can only get so far, and then you run up against the end. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next session. So one thing that we know for sure about complex systems, we learned this a long time ago. Anybody who's dealt with complex systems, it doesn't matter, again, if it's software or not, and that is, for complex systems, here's a process that does not work. Smash, big change. Guaranteed in a complex system, any big change will mess it up. We know that. Anybody knows that of complex systems. This is pretty much standard knowledge. And yet we sit on processes which say, I talked to somebody yesterday that had an annual release cycle yet. That's a smash, okay? Quarterly releases are a smash. Anymore today, you know, releases, the concept of releases is a smash. So think about this. When you make a big change, all bets are off. You will have unexpected consequences, you will have problems. The other thing we know for sure is what does work. And this is what works. Yes? You poke it a little bit and you see what happens. And you fix it and you poke it a little bit, and that's the process we need. Okay? We need to get here. As lots of the world in other areas has figured this out, it's time for us to figure this out too. So if there's one thing that you should be thinking hard about, it is how do I build a deployment pipeline so that independent teams can independently deploy at will. Now there's a lot in that sentence I just said. But if you think about a code base, you know, the thing that protects a code base over time is somebody who understands it. But, you know, people get old and code, you know, there gets to be this thing called legacy. However, if you have an area of the code that is owned by a team, you actually can turn over to people and the team can still own that area. What happens is when the ownership is spread out or somebody owns 50 million things and can't pay attention anymore, then the code starts getting old. So we need to create a way where people can pay attention to their piece of the code and make sure it works well and has good behavior in respect to the other pieces of code. And if you think about, it's true that Netflix goes down sometimes and Amazon Web Services goes down sometimes, but based on how much stuff is happening there, the amount of time those things go down is really, really small. And the recovery is really, really amazingly fast. They've figured something out about how you make really big stuff work. And there's some lessons there, which we'll talk about again a little bit later, because I only have 2 more minutes, yes? Something like that. Oh, 10 more minutes. 5 more minutes? Oh, we started 5 minutes late. Yeah, well, okay, still. You need to build a continuous deployment pipeline where independent teams can own independent pieces. And actually, since I do have that time, I'm going to do something interesting. I am going to get out of here and just show something from later. Because this is what systems look like today. This is what they looked like in 1995. Okay, you had your thick client-server app, you had your well-defined stack with middleware, runtime, and operating system, you had monolithic physical infrastructure for good reason. Because if you put your database across servers, then you couldn't have guaranteed complete transactions. This is what it looks like in 2015. Not this year, last year. Basically, thin apps on a mobile or a tablet, assembled by developers are assembling these with best available services, and it's running on any available physical infrastructure. This is where the world is or is going if you're not there yet. And if you think about this as the future, then you have to think about how do I have teams own these things and deploy them independently as needed when they want. That's what you're trying to get to in the next generation of stuff, okay? So if we go back to this one, problem with this is I have to go completely in and out, otherwise it messes me up. In conclusion, I'm going to just show you one last thing. And that is, if you take a look at these digital organizations that are really impressive, I always like to say Spotify because it's a European company that's just as amazing as any American company, so why bother with our American examples? What do highly successful digital organizations do? Well, what they do is constantly evolving products. What they don't do is projects. Okay? They do products, evolving products, not projects. Projects get over with. Products don't. They solve problems. They don't deploy features. Features are things that something might, that somebody asked for. Problems are customer-focused issues that have to be resolved. They work with hypotheses. I think if we do this, then we're going to get this result. And it doesn't actually matter how much it costs. It matters that the amount of time you invest in it is worth the result that the hypothesis guesses you will get. They work with full stack teams. All the people necessary to put that product on the market. Everybody from development, testing, operations, deployment, product, marketing, sales, you name it, a full stack team, not just IT, not just development. Testing at the end doesn't happen because it doesn't have to, because tests are specifications which are automatically checked as the code is written. So that if I write bad code, and I will because I've been a developer and I make mistakes, everybody does. I want to know immediately that I made a mistake. And this process says, let's make sure that the spec is there and automatically runs, so when I write some code, I know right away, oops, I made this little tiny mistake. And it tells me because the process tells me. There is a deployment pipeline rather than releases. These companies don't know what a release is anymore. Although they can cause a release for marketing reasons, they surely do not need to have a release for technical reasons. In fact, code is deployed all the time and then it's turned on with a switch when the time is right. The development team has an immediate connection. I hate to say it, but outsourcing is not kind of the way things are going anymore, not even in banks. I was talking with a CIO of a massive US bank who'd been in his job for 3 years, and he said, when I came, everything was outsourced and we had project managers. Now I have 6,200 people in my department that do everything from our private cloud to deployment to product development and everything. Because we can't afford that time lag. And we need the immediate connection. Federated architecture. It's a pretty fundamental concept, and without it, you can't do a whole lot of these other things that I was just talking about. So this is where you need to be heading, okay? You've probably got a lot of this going on. You need to be going in that direction and picking which one is the most important one first, and going that way. Now, one last comment. I gave this talk in South America, Uruguay, at a big Agile conference there, the South American Agile Conference, maybe 6 months ago. And somebody came up to me afterwards and said, yeah, I agree with everything you said, except there's that thing on outsourcing. And since I'm an outsourcing company, I didn't like that. He said, but you know what? I know you're right. And if you are an outsourcing company, think about that. Okay, if you are a development arm that is expected to understand customers and do smart things for them, that's not going to go away. But if you are a take orders kind of a outsourcing organization, you might reconfigure your concept to become a much more full service group. So with that, I think there's no time for questions because at 10 o'clock we start again. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.